Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel. Insert usual apology for my neighbours if you should hear them. They're quite bad today, but aside from my usual issues, I've been continuing working on the replanning of my vampire epic. If you didn't see the first video, I will leave links to it, but it's an hour long. So to hopefully briefly recap, I have a vampire story that I've been working on since the 90s and it's really complicated, and up until last year I was a discovery writer, so all of that complication was just in my head and I've decided to put it on paper. Enter notebook. So what I had done last time I created a video about this was start making mind maps around my main character and using some negative feedback to try and start addressing some of the issues. So we have made some progress. First up, I have made so many mind maps I now have to have tabs. Now what we've basically got here is a section of tabs which relate to the mind maps for the main character, and then these ones are for the other characters who really do have stories of their own. The initial plan was for them to just be little side stories, like individual chapters dispersed through the main character's story, but yeah, they're books now. So I previously mentioned that I thought the series was up to 9 books. I've trimmed an entire book. So one of the pieces of negative feedback that I was talking about in my previous video was to do with an original monster that I had created and some difficulties that I was having getting people to understand what I was doing with it. Now, when I started making all these mind maps, I was able to better visualize the role that this monster has in the main character's life, and then an issue arose where I had my character in, put that down, I had my main character in this location encountering the monster, and then I had them in this location. I had nothing showing the transition between these two places. And the only reason the character was over here was because they had to encounter the monster. So I had sort of quite a brief, the character arrives, encounters the monster, and then is mysteriously gone and is now over here for some reason. So that had to be addressed. And I realised that everything that was happening here was just set up to introduce the monster, who would become important at the very end of like the last book, or maybe second to last book. And the more I thought about it, the more I actually just didn't like the plan for the destiny of the monster in general. So I deleted that thread. I have now got my character never here to begin with, just goes straight to here. So I've cut out everything that relates to that location. That means the encounter with the monster and also the other people that the main character is interacting with. One of those people was going to be the focus of a book, so without the need for that interaction, that character has gone. So that has saved me so much effort. Just delete it. I actually really like this idea because it allows me to change the nature of the beast a bit in regards to this original monster. I haven't removed it from the story, but because I no longer have to introduce it in a certain way, and because I've changed the fate of it, certain elements of the story are suddenly much easier to tell. I don't have to try and figure out convoluted ways for my character to get to the places they need to be to encounter the monster. And there's a world building thing that was, actually 2 world building things that was simplified by changing the nature of the monster and the role that it had to play. By changing its role, I was able to, I'm repeating myself, yes, I was able to just simplify a whole bunch of things by changing the monster's role, and I'm really happy with those changes. The role of the monster isn't actually super important to plot. I mean, it would have been if I'd kept those elements and the final fate of it there, but it didn't actually affect the main character. It really just kind of gave her something to do. It was a way of filling time and space within the story. And I don't think the story loses anything for having those changes be made. So I'm really happy with that. I've also changed the motivations and backgrounds of a couple of the third person perspective characters. One's a protagonist, one's an antagonist. And those changes I'm really happy about. What I've realised in laying everything out on paper and not just having it kind of floating around in the ether of my mind was that I was reusing the same types of motivations over and over and over. And this was because, well, to be honest, I was a baby writer and kind of bad at it, let's be frank. I've realised that since I kind of started thinking about this, I've obviously become a better writer. I don't know that that is obvious. It's obvious to me just because of the way that I'm thinking about stories and structure and what is and isn't there and what is and isn't okay. In writing these down, one of the things that I was trying to work through was the way that I had handled time. In my previous attempt at writing this story, let me put this down so I'm not keeping playing with it. In my first attempt to write the story, I had multiple characters. I had a first person perspective and I had multiple third person perspectives, and they're all kind of jumbled together. There was lots of shifts in location and time and perspective, and it was too hard to manage. The people who were reading it were getting really confused. I have talked about this extensively in the last video. And I was floating the idea of writing it in a completely linear way. And I think I have settled on that as what I want to do. But I think there's two options. As it currently stands, there's a maximum of 8 books. I'm slightly still shuffling around whether it might be 8, 7. Some of the ideas or plots are still a little bit underdeveloped. This is very much a work in progress, but let's just for argument's sake say there are 8 books currently. 3 of those would be focused on the original main character of the whole thing, and then there are 5 additional characters who have really interesting stories. And initially, yes, I was thinking about having them all mixed together. But I'm thinking we're just going to tell it beginning to end. Instead of having jumps back and forth, we'll have just the character in the Stone Age, and then her life will overlap with the character, say, in the Bronze Age. And then that character will just vanish from the story and it will shift over to the Bronze Age character, have their story, and then they'll encounter a character who's, say, Iron Age. This is a very not specific. So the idea is that you won't go back and forth between perspective characters, you'd actually stick with them for the entire duration of their story. I think this is potentially risky in that you'd kind of forget about stuff maybe, but if each story is completely contained, then maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe this creates a series where you can actually just pick up any book and it is intact and complete, I think is the word that I wanted there. It's complete and you don't have to worry about, oh well, this is the 3rd book. Yes, you might understand more if you got 1 and 2, but you could actually start at book 3. That's one possibility. I do think though there's an option to, instead of just having books 1 through 8, to have the same approach but have books 1 through 5 all told in the 3rd person perspective, and then have like a companion trilogy with the other 3 books. There's some pros and cons with each approach. The character who the companion trilogy would be about would appear in the other 5 books. So it's not like you wouldn't know what was happening or anything in terms of that character's existence. The idea is that there would be some things that you didn't know necessarily, that the story would work if you read 1 through 5 and it would seem like a complete story, but with a few things maybe left unanswered, and then the companion trilogy would fill those in as you see the missing character's point of view. I don't know. I have to make a decision about this because hang on, got my numbers right. The first book of the potential trilogy would be the second book of the series if I combined them into an 8-book series. So I don't necessarily have to make that decision whilst writing book 1, but I have to know before I start writing book 2, because that depends on whether I write this book or this book. The story I think would benefit from being read in those 2 chunks. I don't know, it's really hard to try and go through it without the spoilers. What would end up happening if I told it 1 through 8 instead of 5 and 3? It would change back and forth from one book being third person, one book being first person, then another book being third, back and forth. I don't know how a reader would feel about that. I feel like some readers have very, very strong preferences for one point of view or the other, and would potentially become like enraged if they started reading a third person series and then suddenly there was a first person element. So something that I've thought about doing is having a first person narrator still being present within the third person books, but just like as a prologue and epilogue, so you knew that there was a narrator somewhere along the way. So it would still have time jumps by necessity because book 1 starts before the character that's first person is born. So it would have to be like them in the future talking about something, referencing the past and wondering about it in the first person, and then like chapter 1 would jump back in time and be the third person story that follows through that book. Obviously I still have a lot to think about, like so freaking much, but I'm really liking the progress that I've made. At the moment I'm hoping that I can just spend a little bit more time on this, and maybe I'll have a robust enough plan to write, or at least draft, book 1 during normal nano. However, I do have a plan if I don't, and I think that is the plan I'll actually go ahead with, which will be to focus on my Camino story and actually finishing it. I have a very short list of things that I have to fix. I will talk about that in the next video if I decide to commit to that option. So I guess that's the thing I'm committing to this week. Is next week I will have an announcement as to whether Nano is going to be vampires or Camino. I almost feel like I need you to ask me to wish me luck, because oh my god, it feels like an impossible decision. Let me know in the comments down below what your plans are for Nano if you're taking part. If you enjoyed this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you're new around here, maybe consider hitting subscribe and ringing that bell so you can stay up to date, and I'll see you next time. Bye!